The Copacabana nightclub in New York City was the most glamorous room in America on the evening of November 3rd, 1956. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across white tablecloths. Waiters in crisp tuxedos moved like dancers between tables packed with celebrities, politicians, and men whose business cards said one thing, but whose real business was something else entirely. This was a Copa in its prime, where entertainment and organized crime sat at the same table and clinked the same champagne glasses. Dean Martin was on stage, performing to a sold-out crowd of 800 people. He was at the height of his powers that year, having just finished a string of hit films, and with a voice that could make angels weep. Dean moved across the stage with that effortless cool he was famous for, a drink in one hand, the microphone in the other, making it all look easy. He was singing "Memories Are Made of This," and the audience was completely under his spell. But Dean wasn't the same man he'd been 6 months earlier. Something had changed in his eyes. Something had dimmed in that famous smile. Those who knew him well could see it. The grief that lived behind the performance. The weight he carried that the audience would never know about. At a prime table in the center of the room sat Frank Costello. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Frank Costello was known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, one of the most powerful organized crime figures in America. He controlled politicians, judges, and police commissioners. He had investments in nightclubs, casinos, and racetracks across the country. The Copacabana was one of his properties, and when Frank Costello came to the Copa, everyone knew it. Costello was 65 years old that night, with slick-back gray hair, and the kind of face that had seen everything and been surprised by nothing. He had 5 men with him at his table, all of them connected, all of them dangerous in their own right. They were drinking expensive scotch and smoking Cuban cigars, treating the entertainment like background music for their conversation. The weight Dean carried. 6 months earlier, Dean Martin had received a phone call that every person dreads. His older brother, William, had died suddenly at the age of 42. A heart attack, the doctor said. Their one moment, gone the next. William had been Dean's anchor, his connection to the world before fame, before Hollywood, before any of this glittering, dangerous circus. William Crocetti. He'd been born before Dean had changed his name from Dino Crocetti to Dean Martin. William had stayed in Steubenville, Ohio, working at the steel mill, raising his family, living a normal life while his younger brother became a star. They'd talked every week on the phone. William had been the one person who still called him Dino, who remembered when he was just a kid from an Italian immigrant family, dealing cards in illegal gambling dens to help feed the family. William had never judged Dean for the choices he'd made, for the people he'd had to work with to make it in show business. He'd understood that in the entertainment world of the 1940s and 50s, you couldn't avoid organized crime. The mob controlled the nightclubs, the casinos, the venues where entertainers made their living. You either learned to navigate that world, or you didn't work. Dean had been in Los Angeles filming a movie when William died. He'd flown home immediately, but he was too late. He never got to say goodbye. Never got to tell his brother one more time how much he meant to him. The funeral had been in Steubenville, a small, quiet affair. Dean had stood at the graveside in the rain, surrounded by family but feeling completely alone, and something inside him had broken. After the funeral, Dean had thrown himself back into work. That's what you did. You performed. You smiled. You made people laugh and forget their troubles, even when your own troubles felt like they were drowning you. He'd finished a movie, recorded an album, done his television appearances, played his nightclub engagements. And through it all, the grief sat in his chest like a stone. The people closest to Dean had noticed the change. Frank Sinatra had pulled him aside after a recording session and asked if he was okay. Jerry Lewis, his comedy partner, had seen the emptiness in Dean's eyes between takes. But Dean always said he was fine, always put on a smile, always gave them the performance they expected. Because that's what entertainers did in 1956. You didn't talk about your feelings. You didn't show weakness. You certainly didn't break down in front of an audience. You swallowed the pain and you performed. And if you had to work for men like Frank Costello to keep your career alive, you smiled at them too and you never let them see what you were really thinking. The evening unfolds. Dean was moving through a set with practiced ease, working the crowd, making jokes, transitioning from song to song like he'd done 1,000 times before. The band behind him was tight, professional, following his every cue. This was the Copa at its finest, and Dean Martin was giving him a show worth remembering. From the stage, Dean could see Costello's table clearly. He'd performed for Costello before many times. The mob boss liked to hold court at the Copa, showing off his power, his connections, his control over one of New York's most famous nightclubs. Costello was usually respectful during performances, understanding that good entertainment was good for business. But tonight, there was something different in the air. Costello's crew was drinking heavily, their voices getting louder as the evening progressed. They were celebrating something, passing around a bottle of expensive champagne, toasting each other repeatedly. One of them, a thick-necked enforcer named Lou Gallo, kept making comments that carried the stage. Nothing directly disruptive yet, but Dean could feel the energy at that table shifting. Dean finished at Amore to thunderous applause and took a moment to sip his drink. It was actually apple juice in a rocks glass, but the audience thought it was whiskey, part of the Dean Martin persona. The carefree drunk who could perform brilliantly, while supposedly 3 sheets to the wind. It was all an act, carefully constructed, but it sold records and filled seats. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean said into the microphone, his voice smooth as honey. "You know, I've been thinking. They say money can't buy happiness, but it can buy a yacht big enough to sail right up next to it." The crowd laughed, and at the Copa, the yachts are first class. More laughter. Dean was working the room like the master he was, but his eyes kept drifting back to Costello's table. Something was coming. He could feel it. When you performed in mob-control venues, as long as Dean had, you developed a sixth sense for trouble. Costello leaned back in his chair, smoking a cigar, watching Dean with an expression that was hard to read. Then he said something to the men at his table, something that made them all laugh. It was a dark laugh, the kind that comes when someone's about to do something cruel and wants an audience for it. Dean moved into his next song, "You're Nobody Till Somebody Loves You." His voice filled the room, rich and warm, carrying emotion that the audience could feel but not quite understand. There was something deeper in his performance tonight, something raw. The grief was close to the surface, and he was channeling it into the music. As Dean hit the bridge of the song, Frank Costello raised his hand. It was a small gesture, casual, but everyone at his table immediately went silent. Then Costello raised his voice, speaking loudly enough that nearby tables could hear, loudly enough that it carried to the stage. The cruel joke. "Hey, Dean," Costello called out. "This is a beautiful song, really touching. It reminds me of someone." Dean continued singing, but his eyes were on Costello now. The band kept playing, but there was a tension building. The audience sensed something was happening. "Yeah," Costello continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "It reminds me of your brother William. You remember him, don't you, Dean? Oh, wait, that's right. He's dead." The room went silent. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Even the band faltered, musicians missing notes, the drummer's rhythm stumbling. Dean's voice cut off mid-word. Frank Costello laughed. It wasn't a loud, booming laugh. It was worse than that. It was casual, dismissive, the laugh of a man who just made what he thought was a funny observation and expected everyone else to find it funny too. I mean, he was nobody anyway, right? Costello went on, encouraged by the stunned silence. Just some steel worker in Ohio. Never amounted to anything. Probably better off dead. Saves him the embarrassment of watching his little brother cozying up to guys like me just to keep working. The men at Costello's table shifted uncomfortably. Even they knew this had crossed a line. Lou Gallo looked down at his drink. Another made man named Tony Bender stared at the tablecloth. This wasn't standard tough guy Bender. This was something else. This was Frank Costello, drunk on power and champagne, deciding to hurt someone just because he could. Dean Martin stood on the stage, still holding the microphone. The spotlight was on him. 800 people were watching him, waiting to see what he would do, how he would react, whether he would keep performing or walk off, whether he would fight back or swallow it like he'd swallowed so many other humiliations in his career. Everyone in that room knew who Frank Costello was. Everyone knew what he was capable of. This was a man who'd ordered people killed, a man who controlled unions, judges, politicians, a man you didn't challenge unless you were ready for war. Dean looked at Costello. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding. Costello thought he'd won, thought he'd put Dean in his place, reminded him that no matter how famous he was, no matter how much the audience loved him, he was still just an entertainer, and entertainers were owned by men like Frank Costello. But Costello had made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that Dean's grief would make him weak, that mentioning William would shatter him, would reduce him to either anger or tears, either which would be entertaining for Costello and humiliating for Dean. Instead, Dean felt something else entirely, a clarity, a cold, pure clarity that cut through the grief and the fear and the survival instinct that usually kept him playing nice with the mob, the response that changed everything. Dean gently set the microphone back in its stand. He didn't slam it down, didn't throw it, just placed it carefully, deliberately. Then he walked to the edge of the stage. The spotlight followed him. The entire room held its breath. When Dean spoke, his voice was quiet, not angry, not shaking with rage or hurt, just quiet, calm, and absolutely clear. "Frank," Dean said, "can I ask you something?" Costello grinned, thinking this was going to be good. "Sure, Dean. Ask me anything." "Do you have a brother, Frank?" Costello's grin faltered slightly. "I got 3 brothers." "So what? Are they alive?" "Yeah, they're alive." "What's your point?" Dean nodded slowly. "Then you can't possibly understand what it's like to lose one. You can't understand what it means to get a phone call in the middle of the night telling you that the person who knew you before you were famous, before you were anything, before you even had a name everyone calls you by, is gone. You can't understand what it feels like to realize you'll never hear his voice again, never get his advice, never sit with him and just be brothers." The room was absolutely silent now. People had stopped breathing. This wasn't what anyone expected. Dean continued, his voice still calm, still measured. "My brother William worked in a steel mill his whole life. You're right about that part. He never became famous, never made millions of dollars, never saw his name in lights. But you know what he did do, Frank?" Costello didn't answer. His grin was completely gone now. "He raised 4 kids, Dean said. Good kids. Honest kids. He was married to the same woman for 20 years. He paid his bills. He helped his neighbors. When his father got sick, William took care of him. When his mother needed money, William gave it to her, even when he didn't have much to give. He worked hard every single day of his life, and he never hurt anybody. He never lied. He never cheated. He never killed anyone to get ahead." The last sentence landed like a punch. Everyone in the room understood the implication. Dean wasn't just defending his brother. He was drawing a contrast between his brother and Frank Costello. "You asked if I remember him." Dean went on, "Yeah, Frank, I remember him. I remember everything about him. I remember that he taught me how to throw a baseball when I was 6. I remember that he gave me $20 when I was leaving for New York to try to make it in show business. And $20 was probably all the money he had in the world at the time. I remember that when I called him from California after my first movie, he cried because he was so proud of me." Dean paused. The emotion was there in his voice now, but it wasn't weakness. It was strength. It was love. It was the opposite of what Costello had expected. "So, yeah, Frank, I remember my brother. And the fact that you think his life didn't amount to anything tells me everything I need to know about you. It tells me that you measure a man's worth by his power and his money. You look at someone like William, and you see nothing because he had no power and he wasn't rich. But I look at William, and I see everything. I see decency. I see honor. I see a man who mattered to the people who knew him." Costello's face had gone red. He wasn't used to being talked to like this. Especially not in front of witnesses. Especially not in his own club. "You think you made a funny joke tonight," Dean said. You think you put me in my place by mocking my dead brother, but all you did was show everyone in this room exactly who you are. You showed them that you're the kind of man who thinks cruelty is entertainment, who thinks other people's pain is something to laugh about, who has so little humanity left that you can make fun of a dead man and think you're being clever. Dean walked back to the microphone stand. He picked it up again, and when he spoke next, his voice filled the entire room. Here's the thing about power, Frank. Real power isn't about how many people are afraid of you. It's not about how much money you have or how many judges you own. Real power is about who you are when nobody's watching. It's about how you treat people who can't do anything for you. It's about whether you add something to the world or just take from it. He paused, letting that sink in. My brother William had more real power in his little finger than you'll ever have in your entire life. Because William made people better. He made his kids better. He made his community better. He made me better. And when he died, hundreds of people came to his funeral because they genuinely cared about him, because he touched their lives in positive ways. When you die, Frank, how many people can come to your funeral because they actually cared about you? Not because they're afraid to miss it. Not because they owe you money, but because they genuinely loved you. The silence was deafening. No one in the Copa had ever heard anything like this. Dean Martin, the cool, easygoing entertainer who usually avoided confrontation, was calmly dissecting one of the most powerful mobsters in America. So, go ahead and laugh at my brother's memory if that makes you feel powerful, Dean said quietly. But understand this. Every time you do, every time you mock a good man's life, you're just proving how empty your own life is. You're proving that despite all your power and all your money, you're a small man with a small soul. Dean turned back to the band. From the top, gentlemen, you're nobody till somebody loves you. The music started again. Dean began singing, his voice even more powerful than before, filled with emotion and conviction. He sang for William. He sang for every person in that room who'd ever been dismissed or mocked or treated as less than human by someone with power. The aftermath. Frank Costello sat at his table, frozen. His face was stone. The men around him didn't know where to look. Should they laugh, supporting their boss? Should they stay silent? Should they act like nothing happened? Costello finally stood up. For a moment, everyone thought he was going to charge the stage, going to cause a scene, going to do something violent and unpredictable. Instead, he threw $100 bill on the table and walked out. His crew scrambled to follow him. They left the Copa in silence. And as they did, something remarkable happened. The audience began to applaud, not for the song Dean was singing, for what he'd just done, for the courage it took to stand up to Frank Costello, for defending his brother's memory, for speaking truth to power. The applause grew and grew until it was thunderous. People were standing now, clapping, cheering, some with tears streaming down their faces. Dean continued singing, but his own eyes were wet. When the song ended, Dean spoke into the microphone one more time. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize if I made anyone uncomfortable tonight. That wasn't my intention. But I lost my brother 6 months ago, and I miss him every single day. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let anyone disrespect his memory. I don't care who they are or what they can do to me. Some things matter more than staying safe. Some things are worth fighting for. The applause erupted again, even louder than before. Dean finished his set. Every song had extra weight now. Every lyric meant something more. The audience had seen something real, something true, something that transcended entertainment and touched something deeper in their souls. Backstage afterward, Dean's hands were shaking. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was wearing off, and the fear was setting in. He had just publicly humiliated Frank Costello. He'd called him out in front of hundreds of people. There would be consequences. Jack and Tratter, who managed the Copa, rushed into Dean's dressing room. "Dean, what the hell were you thinking? Do you know what you just did?" "Yeah, Jack, I know what I did." "Costello's going to be out for blood. He's going to." "Let him." Dean interrupted. "I don't care anymore, Jack. I've spent my whole career being polite to guys like that, swallowing my pride, taking their insults, pretending their jokes are funny. And for what? So I can keep working? So I can keep making the money? My brother is dead, Jack. William is gone. And Costello thought that was funny. Thought that was something to mock. Dean's voice broke. I couldn't let that stand. I just couldn't. Jack sat down heavily. I understand, Dean. I do. But you need to be careful now. Really careful. Ripples through the underworld. The story of what happened at the Copa that night spread through New York like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone in the entertainment business had heard about it. By that afternoon, people in Hollywood knew. By the end of the week, the story had reached Las Vegas, Chicago, Los Angeles, every city where entertainment and organized crime intersected. Reactions were mixed. Some mobsters were furious, thinking Dean had disrespected the natural order of things. Entertainers were supposed to know their place. They weren't supposed to challenge men of power. But others, surprisingly, respected what Dean had done. There was a code in the underworld. Strange as it might seem, family was sacred. Dead family members were never to be mocked. Costello had violated that code, and Dean had called him on it. More importantly, Costello's own standing was damaged by the incident. He'd looked weak. He'd been publicly dressed down by an entertainer, and had walked away without doing anything about it, in a world where respect and fear were everything. That was devastating. Word came back to Dean through intermediaries that Costello was angry, but he wasn't going to retaliate. Too many people had witnessed what happened. Too many had seen that Costello had crossed a line first. Going after Dean now would make Costello look even worse, petty and vindictive. Besides, there was another factor at play. Dean's words had resonated with people. His defense of his brother, his moral clarity, his willingness to risk everything for what was right, had made him more than just an entertainer. It had made him a symbol of something important. Hurting Dean Martin now would be bad for business and bad for Costello's reputation in ways that even he, with all his power, couldn't control. The legacy of that night. Dean Martin went on to have one of the most successful careers in entertainment history. He made hit movies, recorded classic albums, hosted a television show that ran for 9 years. He became one of the most beloved entertainers of his generation. But people who were there that night at the Copacabana never forgot what they witnessed. They never forgot seeing a man stand up to one of the most powerful criminals in America, not with violence, not with threats, but with simple moral truth. The incident changed Dean in subtle ways. He was still the same cool, laid-back performer on stage. Still the same funny, charming presence in movies. But those who knew him well said there was a strength in him after that night that hadn't been there before. A line he wouldn't cross. A core of steel beneath the easygoing exterior. He never spoke publicly about what happened with Costello. When reporters asked about it, he'd smile and change the subject. But in private, with people he trusted, he'd talk about William, about what his brother meant to him, about how defending William's memory was the most important thing he'd ever done. Years later, in 1987, Dean's son Dean Paul Martin died in a plane crash. It was the worst moment of Dean's life, worse even than losing William. Dean never fully recovered from that loss. He became more withdrawn, less engaged with the world. But even in his grief over his son, Dean remembered the lesson from that night at the Copa. Some things matter more than safety, more than career, more than anything. Family matters. Memory matters. Standing up for what's right matters. The story of Dean Martin and Frank Costello became part of Hollywood legend, not because of the mob angle or the drama or the famous names involved, but because it represented something essential about human dignity. It showed that courage doesn't always look like violence or aggression. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak a simple truth to someone who has all the power. Frank Costello died in 1973. Reports say that fewer than 20 people attended his funeral, and most of them came out of obligation rather than love. Dean Martin died in 1995. Thousands came to his funeral. They came because he'd made them laugh, because his music had been the soundtrack to their lives, because he represented an era of elegance and cool that felt like it had passed with him. But some people came for another reason. They came because they remembered stories like the one from the Copa in 1956. They remembered hearing about a man who stood up to power, who defended his brother's memory, who proved that true strength isn't about how much you can take, but about what you're willing to stand up for. November 3rd, 1956. The night Frank Costello made a joke about Dean Martin's dead brother and learned that some lines, once crossed, reveal more about you than they do about the person you're trying to hurt. The night Dean Martin showed everyone in the room what real power looks like. Not the power to destroy, but the power to stand firm in your truth, no matter the cost. That's the performance that mattered most. Not the songs, not the jokes, not the movies, but the moment when Dean Martin looked at one of the most dangerous men in America and said, calmly and clearly, "My brother's life mattered. His dignity matters. And I will not let you take that away from him." That's a legacy worth remembering. That's what brotherhood means. That's what it means to be truly powerful. Not because you can hurt people, but because you'll protect them even after they're gone, even when it costs you everything. The story of that night reminds us that we all face choices about who we are and what we stand for. Will we laugh at cruelty to fit in? Will we stay silent when someone with power demeans someone without it? Or will we, like Dean Martin did, stand up and say, "Not today, not ever, not while I'm still breathing"? That choice defines us more than any achievement or any title. It reveals whether we're living with dignity or just existing, whether we're adding something to the world or taking from it, whether we matter beyond our power and our fame. Dean Martin chose dignity. He chose his brother. He chose to be the kind of man who would risk everything to defend a good man's memory. And in doing so, he became more than an entertainer. He became an example of what it means to be human in the deepest, truest sense. That's the real story of that night at the Copacabana. Not about a mob boss and a singer, but about what we owe to the people we love, living and dead. About the courage it takes to stand up for what's right when standing up could cost you everything. About understanding that some things, human dignity, family, love, are worth more than safety or success or survival. Frank Costello thought he could humiliate Dean Martin by mocking his dead brother. Instead, he gave Dean Martin the opportunity to show the world what true strength looks like. And that performance, that moment of moral clarity and courage, matters more than every song Dean ever sang, every movie he ever made, every laugh he ever got. Because in the end, we're not remembered for how successful we were or how powerful we were. We're remembered for what we stood for the moments when we could have stayed silent but chose to speak, for the times when we defended the defenseless, protected the vulnerable, and refused to let cruelty go unchallenged. Dean Martin understood that, and on that November night in 1956, he lived it, and in doing so, he gave everyone who witnessed it, and everyone who hears the story now, permission to do the same, to stand up, to speak truth, to defend what matters, to understand that real power has nothing to do with how much you can take, and everything to do with what you're willing to give, to risk, to sacrifice for the people and principles you hold dear. That's the legacy of that night. That's the lesson Dean Martin taught Frank Costello and everyone else in that room. That's the truth worth remembering. Some performances matter because they're beautiful. This one mattered because it was true.